Our dialogue today is under the title, What is Happening in America? And I would like to welcome Dean Nabil Fahmy, Dean of School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, to give us his keynote speech. Thank you.
Well, first, welcome to everybody. We're honored and very pleased to have you here. This is not a keynote, it's simply a welcome to you all. We have three brilliant participants on the panel this evening, and I'm going to much prefer to leave them give them enough time to share with us their thoughts, their ideas, to get engaged in a discussion. I simply want to say that we started the Tahrir dialogues very soon after the revolution in 2011 with the idea of engaging the public in a serious, constructive, sometimes critical, but always constructive discussion of public issues. Sometimes we engage in foreign policy issues like today. Other times we get into domestic issues, sometimes some social issues, but there are always issues that relate to the public domain, how you manage the public domain. And we are always happy to see participants coming in here, not only from the university, but also from our friends in and around town, because as we engage our students, it's very important for us to be able to tell them the general sense of what's happening in the country and in the region. So what we hear from you is always useful and important for us. This evening, we've taken the advantage of the presence of one of my long-standing friends, but also a very prominent political scientist, Dr. Shibli Talhami, who is the Anwar Sadat Chair of Government at the University of Maryland. He is a former diplomat for a certain point in time, and then also has been in academia for a long time. He's an advisor to many policy circles in America, mostly about the Middle East, but not only about the Middle East. I've known Shibli for many years, and I don't remember when I had a discussion with him that was not useful. Not frequently, but occasionally we've differed, but it's always been an extremely useful discussion and something that I've come out with added insight. We have also with us today Dr. Mohammed Kamal, political scientist from the Cairo University. Dr. Kamal is, again, a friend from a number of years now, from initially when I was in Washington, and then since I came back, we've engaged frequently on issues of interest to Egypt and America. And we chose Dr. Kamal to come in here not only for his political science background, but also because he's actually an expert on America and has not only academic experience, but also professional experience in how the American system works. The last but not least participant we have today is my colleague and friend Karim Haggag, who is a professor at American University in Cairo and presently the director of the Center for American Studies. Karim is a diplomat, worked in America also, and the setup we've put here is we're going to give Shibli a chance to share with us his insight, and then Dr. Kamal will raise some questions, start the discussion, and of course, in that process, and adding substance to it also, will be Karim's role in this whole debate. Now, in issuing the invitation to Shibli, I was torn between trying to come up with a sophisticated, complicated academic title that would resonate well for an article in a peer-reviewed journal, as academics like to refer. But even though I've followed America for a long number of years, I felt, well, why don't I ask the question that I often ask myself about America? I think America is going through a very strange phase. And if it isn't strange for Americans, it's strange for all of us. So we simply chose the title of Where is America Going? And that's really where I'm going to leave it to Shibli to start the debate. But let me invite Karim first to take charge of the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Fahmy. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here, and it's my distinct pleasure to moderate this session. Let me just add to the words of welcome that Dean Fahmy offered to formally introduce our speakers for tonight. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Shibli Talhami. Dr. Talhami is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Saban Center at the Brookings Institution. Oh, I see. Okay. And a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Dr. Talhami is a frequent contributor with his insights and perspectives to numerous media outlets in Washington and the United States, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, among many others. He is also a member of several prominent boards in his capacity as an advisor to the Council on Foreign Relations, the Human Rights Watch, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the U.S. Advisory Group on Public Diplomacy for the Arab and Muslim world. Let me just add to what Dean Fahmy said in terms of those of us who have worked in Washington and known Shibli for quite some time have always found him a sane and sober voice in the noise of the commentariat that comes out of the Beltway in Washington. So it's a pleasure to welcome you, Shibli. It's also my pleasure to welcome my friend, Dr. Mohammed Kamal, who is a professor of political science and the director of the Center of International Area Studies at Cairo University. Dr. Kamal is also a part-time professor at the American University in Cairo. He holds a PhD in international relations from Johns Hopkins University and is also a regular contributor in many Egyptian outlets, including Al Ahram and Al Masr Al Yom. So it's a distinct pleasure to have Dr. Kamal with us to lend his perspective on this issue. Shibli, as Dean Fahmy said, we have phrased tonight's issue in the form of a question. What is happening in America? And it is a question that you might surmise reflects a certain amount of confusion, a certain amount of perplexity, and a certain amount of astonishment at just the fluidity of political events in Washington. So with that, let me give you the floor, and we look forward to your insights in dispelling some of this confusion. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much for this. Can you hear me okay, or is this connected? Thanks so much for this generous introduction, and thank you, Dean Fahmy, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to see you. And it's a pleasure to be at the American University in Cairo. I'm also impressed to see what has happened with the School of Public Policy since you started it. It's not on? Let me use this. This is better, right? I have, it's really a pleasure to visit again, and it's a pleasure to be a guest to the school that I know you built and is now prominent and globally well known. The American University in Cairo, which I had a pleasure to visit the last 2 days, an amazing place, how it's developing and expanding. I'm also thankful to my two colleagues whom I've had the pleasure of knowing for a long time, like and respect. And I see a lot of friends in the audience that I have not seen in a while, so it's really a pleasure for me to be here. And forgive me for speaking in English, but I'm happy to speak in Arabic if particularly with questions, if you want to ask questions later on. My understanding is that this is being simultaneously translated into Arabic for those who are not following the English. What I'd like to do is just give you a little bit of flavor about how divided America is now. You know, what is going on in American society, America as a country, beyond Trump. Now, I can't start without talking about Trump because that's the big subject for everyone. That is the headline, that is the news. So I will start by saying a few things about Trump, and then talk more about the deeper divide in America for a conversation. And so even about Trump, there is a huge divide of interpreting his phenomenon. We all know that he won the elections by something like 70, 80,000 votes in 3 states, while losing, the overall popular vote by almost 3 million votes. That's the way our system works. He won fair and square. But it was very close, and it could have gone differently. So a lot of people have different interpretations of why he won. And on that, it's implicit in a lot of the conversations that we have that people have different interpretations even about why he won. One interpretation, of course, is that he's the anti-establishment candidate. This was, of course, the theory that even preceded his victory. I even, with a colleague, wrote an article 2 weeks before the election saying that he could win because there was this anti-establishment mood that we could find in our polling. So there was a theory that it was an anti-establishment mood. There is a theory that it really is all about the whites rallying behind him and being energized because they see him as the lost savior of white control in America, and with them the Christian right, the Christian white, so to speak. Those are the theory about him energizing people who hadn't voted in the past who came in to vote this time around. There's a theory about Hillary Clinton being a weak candidate and therefore, didn't do as well as it could. But then there is the other theory, which of course is very prevalent, and now a lot of people believe it, is that had it not been for Russian intervention in our election, he would not have won. I'm not taking a position here, by the way. I'm just giving you a flavor of the varieties, even of explanation of why Trump won, including General Clapper, James Clapper, who was the head of national intelligence, who wrote a book recently about it was a memoir, but he focused mostly about the Russian intervention. In the book, he says that his own conclusion is that without the Russian intervention, Donald Trump would not have won. So you have people who are very serious people who believe that it was really all about Russian intervention. So you have all kinds of varieties of interpretations about why he won the elections. Let's start with that. Second, you have an interpretation about what drives the man. What does he stand for? Who is he? What motivates him? This is part of the big debate. So you have people, and I sort of remind people sometimes that during the election campaign, when he was running against more than a dozen other Republican candidates, Jimmy Carter, former president, many of you know him, he's in the news this week because of the 40th anniversary of Camp David, was asked, whom he preferred among the candidates that were available on the scene. He said he preferred Trump to someone like Cruz because he thought Cruz, or Ted Cruz from Texas, was so ideological, whereas he said Trump, quote, is malleable, meaning he's pragmatic, he could be swayed one way or the other, he's not going to be entrenched. And even to this day, with all the things against Trump, there are many among the Democrats who want change, still don't want him impeached because they fear the vice president, who is an ideological right, Christian right person, they fear him even more. So there is obviously keep that in mind, that there's a theory that prevailed early on. It's less prevalent now for a variety of reasons, that he's more or less a pragmatist. And there were people who, were open to him, even they didn't like him, they knew his weaknesses, not only because he was non-ideological, but because some of the positions that he took, in general, there were positions that seemed to be more in the mainstream. For example, he opposed the Iraq War. He seemed to be not inclined to intervention. He seemed to be not inclined to, is this not working, or? No? Okay. So there is that kind of interpretation of Donald Trump, but I think that at this time, that's a weaker interpretation. A second interpretation of him is that he is really the lost hope, that he's really a racist, white supremacist who is energizing the base along these lines. And there are people, obviously, who believe that, both on the left and right, and so forth. There are people who think he's just a very good businessman. He doesn't know much about anything else, but he's actually a very good negotiator. He's helping the economy. But the most prevalent theory about him is that he is a narcissist, that he is focused only on Donald Trump, that he is not really following other issues, that he has the attention span of 2-year-olds, that he doesn't focus on issues, and that is gaining a lot of currency because of all the books that are coming out, the most recent of which is the Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward, who just been reading his book now and who confirms sort of a lot of these things. And that, for that reason, a lot of people believe that this kind of tendency, being narcissistic, focused on the self, and not having any attention on any issue, going from one issue to another, makes him extremely vulnerable to manipulation. And that manipulation is both by advisors who might be ideologically or strategically motivated in one way or another, by fundraisers, by outside interest groups, and also by foreign powers who could manipulate his weaknesses to focus him on particular issues. That is really kind of, I would even say, it's probably the most prevalent theory. And then finally, there is a theory that is increasingly gaining currency among some of the intelligence establishment, that he is beholden to a foreign intelligence power. And that is not to be underestimated in terms of its strength among the intelligence community. That somebody holds something against him. Obviously, Russia is the one that is most mentioned, and therefore that he literally is under the influence of a foreign power. And that is something that is substantially popular among, I wouldn't just say critics on the left or Democrats, I would say even more so among former members of the intelligence community who are outside, who now say it out loud about their suspicion about what they may hold. I had just a few weeks ago, I had hosted at an event of the University of Maryland, James Clapper, the former head of national intelligence. And he had not addressed the question of whether there was undue influence on Donald Trump from any outside power, but he did address the question. I asked him directly if he had to make an opinion based on his own experience in intelligence all these years, what do you think it is? And he thinks that most likely something to do with financial issues. So that's a prevalent theory. I'm not taking a position, mind you. I am just giving you a flavor of the varieties of debate about why he won and about what drives him. So even about that, we are so deeply divided in America every single day. And if you want to look at that divide, all you have to do is look at our television stations. If you go to his supporters like Fox News, which is popular on the right, and then you turn the television and listen to MSNBC or CNN, and you think you're in two different countries simultaneously. It's not one and the same. It's two different narratives, two different stories, two different interpretations. So we're deeply divided. But beyond Trump, America is even more divided than that in terms of what it represents today. Is just give you a little bit of flavor of that divide. I conduct public opinion polling. I have a Center for Public Opinion Polling. I conduct public opinion polling sometimes in the Middle East, but now I'm focused almost entirely on the United States, where I'm looking at American public opinion, especially on foreign policy issues, particularly toward the Middle East, but not just on the Middle East. And I'm also looking at American politics domestically, particularly the question of identity, how Americans define themselves. And so I start by observing that if you think about the post 9/11 era, after the tragedy of 9/11, we had this discourse here and there, meaning here in the Middle East and there in America, about the clash of civilization or the clash of values. Obviously, most of the elites rejected that. I did. I still do. Many reasons to reject the thought that there's what we're witnessing is really a clash of civilization. But nonetheless, it is the one that had taken place. And some people still believe that is what driving the issues here and there. But when you look at the numbers, when you look at the polls, I would say it is obvious that the clash within civilizations is much bigger than the clash between civilizations. And let me give you examples of how deeply divided we are. We're more deeply divided among ourselves than we are divided from Egypt, than we're divided from Saudi Arabia even, than we're divided from Jordan. What do I mean? Let me just give you an example, even on issues that have to do with the Middle East. Take, for example, the travel ban. That is the ban initiated by President Trump to stop people from certain Muslim countries to come into the United States. Now, there were a number of polls done here in the Arab world about do people support the ban or oppose the ban that was initiated by President Trump. And across the Middle East, in the surveys that I have seen, as an average, about 76%, including here in Egypt, oppose the travel ban. Well, would you expect that, obviously? You might expect even more than that, but 76% oppose it. Surprisingly, about 17% support the ban for a variety of reasons why they might do that. Now, what about in America? So when we ask the questions in America about do you support the travel ban or do you oppose the travel ban, we have 50% say they oppose it and 49% say they support it. And we're divided practically 50-50. So what's the difference between the Arab world and America? About 26 percentage points. 76 oppose it here, 50% oppose it there, about 26 percentage difference. Now, what about when you look at the data, Democrat and Republican in America? If you break it down by Republican and Democrat, we have 88% of Democrats opposing it and 86% of Republicans supporting it. Yeah, the difference between the two is about 70 percentage points. The difference between the Republican, it can't be more opposed. I mean, this is like almost unprecedented. It's like two countries. I had been doing polling for decades. I don't recall seeing this kind of divergence on any issue in America. So the divide inside is much bigger than our divide with you, or our divide with most parts of the world. We are that deeply divided. Take other examples that can tell you what is driving this divide. Is it really a genuine divide in issues? Are people really analyzing the ban objectively? Are they really analyzing this is good for America, this is bad for America, this is good for me, this is bad for me? And when you do extensive analysis, that's not what's driving it. What's driving it is what we call identity politics. Let me give you an example on another issue that matters to you here, and that is attitudes toward Islam and Muslims. So, for example, we all know that during the presidential campaign, when President Trump was running, and since the presidential campaign, he highlighted what he thought was a Muslim threat, and he called, the terrorist attacks Islamic terrorism. And there were a lot of people who thought that he was really riling up Americans against Islam and Muslims. And we know that he intensified opposition among certain groups because we've seen some backlash. We've seen some attacks. We've seen some rise of Islamophobia in some quarters. We've seen some Muslim Americans who have suffered from certain incidents that have occurred as a reaction to the enhanced rhetoric. So what you might suppose from that is that there was actually a rise in anti-Muslim attitudes in America. Well, let me tell you something, that's not what happened. And let me give you some examples in the polling that I've done. So I have done 6 polls over a period of 2 years from the beginning of the campaign through his first year in Trump's first year in office. And those 6 polls every few months, I would ask a question, what are your attitudes toward Muslims, favorable or unfavorable? What are your attitudes toward Islam, favorable or unfavorable? And among other questions. But those are the ones that we have done to measure the trends, to see how public opinion is changing. So throughout the 6 polls, from the beginning of the presidential campaign, all the way through the first year in office, what did we find? We find that Americans started liking Islam more and started liking Muslims more. Every single time, even after a terrorist attack on American soil that was blamed on Muslims. Every single time. So incrementally, it went from, the first poll, the next poll was higher favorable rating, the following poll was higher favorable rating, the following poll was even higher favorable rating, and so forth. It went up. In some cases, it went up by 18 percentage points over less than a 2-year period. So astonishing change in such a short period of time. So you say, how is this possible? First of all, it's not possible that people learn so much about Islam and Muslims that they're going to make such a quick analysis that will result in such a huge change in public opinion. Well, how do you analyze it? Well, if you look at what happened in the breakup of the demographics, the story is easy to understand. Almost all of the change for the positive came among non-Republicans. Republicans didn't change at all, and the Democrats' opinion started improving toward Islam and Muslims, and so independence is the same, started improving. Why? Because it was a backlash to Donald Trump and what he stood for, and he was associated with anti-Muslims, and therefore they started rallying behind Muslims and behind Islam. So we are so divided identity-wise that you're either with this camp or this camp, and that's even reflected on issues that are central in the debate, that are issues that tie in to broader issues that are of concern to Americans. I'll give you one final example before I tell you my conclusion in this. The final example has to do with an issue that you all care about and have followed closely, and that is American public attitudes toward the Arab-Israeli issue, the Palestinian-Israel issue specifically. How do Americans feel about this? Now, that is a question that I have been doing public opinion polling on for decades, literally since 1989 is when I did my first poll on that. So we have a tremendous track record on trying to figure out how the public has shifted on this issue. Historically, we've always found, in 1989 and today, by the way, one thing has not changed at all. A majority of Americans, when you ask them, do you want America to take Israel's side or the Palestinian side or to be even-handed? A majority of Americans, about 2/3, always says we want America to be even-handed. Every single time. That has not changed in all the decades, not now either, and not in 1989. And a lot of people don't understand that is where a majority of the public is. What has changed is that group, which is about 1/3 of Americans, who want America to take sides, who want to be more aggressive in foreign policy by taking one side or the other. So that group has always been much more pro-Israel, meaning by a ratio of 4-1 or 5-1, they want to take Israel's side more than they want to take the Palestinian side. But what has changed over these decades is, in the past, it used to be true of both Democrats and Republicans, meaning it used to be both Democrats and Republicans wanted to be even-handed mostly, and those who wanted to take sides wanted to take Israel's side. That's the way it used to be. What we have seen in recent years, and especially in the past 3 years is a dramatic shift based on identity, where overwhelming majority of Democrats, 90%, want the U.S. to be even-handed. And a majority of Republicans, over 50%, want to blatantly take Israel's side. And among the Democrats who want to take sides, one or the other, it's now about even, and among young people, they want to take Palestinian side more than Israel's side. So that identity divide that has emerged in America over the past few years, and exacerbated by the rise of Trump, but not limited to the rise of Trump, has now even been seen, the results of it can be seen even on this issue that has transcended the partisan divide in America. It is very obvious. One last point about identity. Now, you know, I am talking about identity as if we know what it is, and in some case, of course, we say it's Democrat and Republican as shorthand. There is, of course, that's an easy way to divide America, partisan divide, but there is a social values issue that's built into it that has contents about the sort of America they want to see, about the sort of role for America in the world they want to see. It's a package deal. I could elaborate on it in the questions and answers. I'm not going to go into it now. But one thing I want to say is that, remember that Donald Trump ran on America first. And that resonated with a lot of people, obviously his core supporters. Not with a lot of people, by the way. And I would say not even with the majority. But certainly with his base. And you would expect, therefore, that that kind of tone that he set, both in the campaign and since he's been president, would have had an impact on how Americans identify themselves. And yet, it is interesting and surprising to find that Americans see themselves less American today than they did when Trump started running for office. So, what do I mean? One of the questions I ask in my polling, I say, I know everybody has multiple identities. You know, an American is an American, an African American, Black American, Hispanic American, a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, a Hindu. They define themselves by their gender. They define themselves as citizens of the world. So I grant them all these things. I say, I know you can be all these things, but which one is most important to you today? And I study that over time in terms of which one do they think is the most important identity for them at any given time. So what do we find? We find something really interesting, that those who say I'm American first, the number of people who say I'm American first has gone down since Trump started running for office. And even more surprising, it has gone down not only overall among Americans, and not only among Democrats and independents, it has gone down among Republicans. And you might say, how could that be? This is a man who's running on America first. So when we look at the demographics, here's what we find, and something that explains politics a little bit. So among Democrats, those who say that they're less American than they were, where's the rise that compensates for that decline? The rise is among people who say, I'm a citizen of the world, I'm cosmopolitan, I don't see the differences. You know, sort of the anti-Trump. The anti-Trump. So we have a rise in the people who say, I'm more cosmopolitan than I'm American. I'm more egalitarian. I see equality among people than I see a focus on my American identity. In fact, it's about even right now among Democrats. And among young Democrats, more people say I'm a citizen of the world than they say I'm an American first, among young Democrats, below 25. Now, among Republicans, so where does that dip go? Why do people, they obviously didn't go to say I'm egalitarian, not with the tone that is being set. Where did that go? Well, rise in religious identity. The rise in religious identity at the expense of American identity. Among evangelicals in particular, who constitute 40% of the Republican Party, more people now say I'm a Christian first than I'm an American first. And that has been the effect of the presidency of Donald Trump far more than America. First, because he's empowered the evangelicals by what he did and making them a base, and that has clearly had an impact that is different from what people had expected. So where does all that leave us? I'm just going to say three things, and I'm going to leave things open for questions and answers because I'm not going to go into the details. Otherwise, we wouldn't have time for conversation. So the first thing I want to say is this deep divide is only exacerbated by Donald Trump, but it's deeper than Donald Trump. America is a divided country. But I want to say, nonetheless, America is moving toward more egalitarianism and more toleration than you might otherwise expect by the rise of Trump's presidency. Why do I say that? Because all the demographics that are expanding in America, the younger generation, African Americans, Hispanics, other minorities that are rising in importance and numbers in America, the majority of them are on the side of egalitarianism and more on the Democratic side in the political divide than on a Republican. That has not changed. In fact, the one reason why you can argue Trump did better despite that is he was able to get out the vote among the people who supported him more than the others. That's one thing that is going on. So the trend is going away from Donald Trump, not toward Donald Trump. And no one can argue otherwise. You look at the demographic, that is, the trend in America is away from Donald Trump. He may survive now, he may survive the next term, but that's not where the trend in America is going. And we see that in the poll. How do we see that in the polls? Trump has energized his base and is still sticking with him. And there is this joke, he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and they'll still vote for him, or they will still support for him. He does have that kind of hold on his base. But his base has not expanded, in fact, shrunk a little bit. And the number of Republicans has shrunk a little bit. And more importantly, independents are moving away from him. In fact, the most recent poll showed in 1 month there was like a 16 or 18% dip in support among independents. So the trend is not on that side of American identity. Keep that in mind. That's not the way America is changing. And perhaps the base of Donald Trump mobilized and energized and used him because they thought this might be their last chance because they are diminishing in power, and their identity and their set of values that they want to see are losing the battle. And maybe that's one reason why they're energized, because they're losing, not because they're winning. Second, I think in the short term, we're in a mess in America because we're in a paralyzed nation. And it is hard to see an end to the crisis that we now face. In the sense that even with all the indictment of the people around the president and likely indictment to come that might touch his family, and that's increasingly looking like it might happen, it is very hard to envision a scenario where the president would leave before the next presidential election. And it's very hard to envision, even the Democrat may want it. And in any case, even if he leaves, it's very hard to envision that we wouldn't have another president who's going to be polarizing in the current vice president. So in the meanwhile, we're up against a bind. So everybody is focused principally on our next midterm elections in November to see whether Democrats could win at least the House of Representatives in Congress, which would change the political equation. Certainly it would change it in terms of appointments like Supreme Court appointments, and it would change the equation in the ability of Congress then to investigate the president and people around him a little bit more. But that is not necessarily a happy outcome. Obviously, we're talking about more paralysis between now and the next election. In the meanwhile, the President of the United States is still the most powerful man in the world, has more assets at his fingertips than any other man in the world, and we all have to live with the consequences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shibli. I think you've put on the table a lot of food for thought. I found much of what you said not only interesting but intriguing, and I'm sure people will probe you on many of the points you mentioned. Dr. Kamal, I presume you would like to not only add to what Dr. Shibli has put forward, but maybe start us off by challenging him on some of the points he mentioned. And feel free to use the podium, please, if that's more suitable.
Thank you, Karim. I would like also to thank Dean Nabil Fahmy and the School of Global Affairs for the invitation. It's very difficult to comment after Professor Telhami's presentation, and it's actually more difficult to speak on events in the US in the presence of Minister Fahmy and many other distinguished ambassadors. So I'll take this opportunity actually to raise some questions and comments to stimulate more engagement with Dr. Telhami. I might sound a little bit Republican in what I'm going to present, but I'm not really a Republican. I actually worked with Democrats when I was in the US. But I will use that just I will try to play a devil's advocate on some point. I will start with three general points. The first one is elections have consequences, right? So Trump won the presidential elections, promising that he will start a trade war with China. He will take a tougher position on illegal immigration. He will move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So one shouldn't really be very surprised when he starts implementing his campaign promises. The second point relates to a statement that was made famous by the American journalist Selena Zito almost 2 years ago in the Atlantic magazine, when she said, media / liberals continue to take Trump literally but not seriously, while his supporters take him very seriously but not literally. The part about his supporters, I think, is still valid today. A lot of his supporters believe that he's not going to build a wall with Mexico and the Mexicans are not going to pay for it, but they know very well that he's going to take a tough position on immigration. They know that he will not implement all his campaign promises, but they know that the US is moving in the right direction under his leadership. And this base is still there. The third point relates to the problem with Trump administration. Reading Bob Woodward's book, one comes to the conclusion that the real problem is with the management of the administration, the management of the White House. I quote from his book, when you put a snake and a rat and a falcon and a rabbit and a shark and a seal in a zoo without walls, things get nasty and bloody. That's how he described the White House. So the question is, to what extent the problem with the Trump administration relates to the management of the administration, given that there hasn't been a major crisis and the economy is doing well. Now I would like to move to the midterm elections. Most expectation that the Democrats will win the House. Dr. Talhami talks about demographics and the work in favor of the Democratic Party. That's for sure, but the real issue is not about numbers, not about demography, but about the turnout level. Will the Democrats be able to mobilize more votes than the Republicans in the midterm elections? I'm actually not sure about that. I was reading a piece in the Wall Street Journal recently, which argued that Democrats have harder time than Republicans in getting voters who show up for presidential elections to turn out for midterm elections. And they gave different examples of that. So the question here again is to what extent the Democratic Party is going to motivate Democrats to show up in the midterm elections. I think the Democratic Party is giving emphasis to minority votes and to younger voters, the so-called millennials or millennium generations. There has been an increase in the vote registrations of young voters, especially after shooting incidents that took place in Florida and so on. But no one sure that those young voters will turn out on the day of elections and vote for the Democrats. The Hispanics, I also still have many questions about that related to their economic conditions, which I will talk about in a few seconds. Another point related to the evangelical vote. Dr. Talhami talked about the evangelicals and their power in the political map, and some have argued that the Democratic turnout advantage could be eroded, could be balanced by an energized evangelical vote. And many evangelical organizations are working hard today to turn out more evangelicals to vote for the Republican Party. I would like also to raise few points about the US economy. I heard conflicting reports about the impact of Trump economic policies. Some have argued that these policies have benefited only the rich, but reports from the Census Bureau and the Labor Department show that the faster economic growth have helped all income levels and have lifted about 1 million people out of poverty in 2007, and the living conditions, the incomes of blacks and Hispanics have improved because of the Trump administration, his emphasis on deregulation and encouraging the private sectors, lower taxes, and so on. So again, my question here is to what extent this will also affect the turnout level, especially among Hispanics. Another point I would like to raise today, and I would like to get a response from Dr. Talhami, relates to the Democratic Party. Definitely the US is changing, the Republican Party is changing, but the Democratic Party is also changing. And in recent primaries in New York and in Massachusetts, with the elections of Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts and Alexandria Cortez in New York, both defeated long-term incumbents who stayed in the House for more than 2 years. And both actually have certain views about the identity of the Democratic Party and how to deal with Trump. For example, both of them want to impeach President Trump, and both of them want to abolish the US immigration and customs enforcement. So is this the trend of the future in the Democratic Party? More leftist, more radical? Finally, 2 questions related to foreign policy. I know you're writing a book now on the role of evangelicals in foreign policy, and I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more on their influence on the Trump administration. Many people argue here that the decision to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was due to the pressure of the evangelical group. Also, Trump's escalation of his policy with Turkey, which was mainly about an evangelical priest who was imprisoned by Turkey, is also affected Trump foreign policy. So how do you assess their influence on Trump foreign policy? Finally, I will end with an argument or a quote by Karl Rove, the Republican strategist, who argues that Trump numbers improved following the announcement of the Singapore summit with North Korea leader. And Mr. Trump is a powerful political force when he is viewed as a world leader and a president, and his number diminishes when he engaged in tweeting about critics. Do you think Trump will learn the lesson and will engage in a major foreign policy initiative, maybe with Korea or maybe with other countries, that might change or improve the numbers for the Republicans before the election day on November 6th? Last point, actually, which came to my mind when you were talking about public opinion survey and numbers and so on. Why people who were working on survey didn't get it in the election of Trump? Why nobody predicted the election of Trump? What went wrong with that? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kamal. Thank you both, gentlemen, for what I found a very packed set of comments to start off our discussion this evening. Shibli, the takeaway, the main takeaway I come out with from your comments is that American politics seem to resemble more and more Middle East politics. I mean, it seems that identity politics was something that our region was mired in for centuries. And now here you are telling us about the rise of identity politics, the deep divides, the cleavages, really, that exist across America. And I was wondering if I could take the prerogative of the moderator to pose a couple of broad themes that maybe you would address. You've put so much on our table, perhaps we could return the favor and put more on your table. First of all, if you could probe a little deeper about the causes behind the rise of identity politics. I mean, what is driving this intense polarization that we see in the political landscape now? The deeper causes. As I think you rightly mentioned, this is a phenomenon that will likely outlast Trump. So what is driving this? It's very hard to understand. And perhaps related to this, is this really new? I mean, you in your polling, you mentioned several times that the degree of polarization seems to be unprecedented. But then historians tell us that, for example, this streak of populism has occurred on and off throughout the course of American history, coupled with the rise of some variation of identity politics. Is that really true? Is this a phenomenon that is qualitatively new, or is it maybe a culmination of trends that have been going on for quite some time? And then finally, if you can talk a little bit about how you hinted at how all of this is putting tremendous stress on the political system at large. And now we have a question that is also intensely debated in the United States about will American democracy survive? And I assume the debate around that question is no less polarized than the debates around the other questions that you featured in your talk. But what do you think about that question? I mean, the fact that we have, a prominent magazine such as The Atlantic having this question as the feature of its most recent issue, I think is very telling. The fact that that question is actually posed. And then to Dr. Kamal, one question. You have for a long time been a very able interpreter of America to Egyptian audiences. I was wondering if you could perhaps reflect a little bit about how Egyptians perceive the mess that Shibli has described. I mean, what do Egyptians make of this? How do they interpret what's going on in America? Because I think that will lend a lens by which we can gauge Egyptian perceptions of what is going on in America, which is no less interesting. Shibli?
Thank you. Of course, there are a lot of questions on the table. They're all excellent, really interesting comments. I'm not going to address every single one of them, otherwise we wouldn't get out of here tonight. But I will relate to three themes that came out of both sets of questions. One theme is really about sort of what is driving this identity divide, and tied to the economic issue that everybody's benefiting from these tax cuts and Trump shift. And I think that there is something here that is obviously deep that has been taking place in America and globally, and they're tied together. In the American context, you have what we have seen as what we call the impact of globalization and the demographic changes that are simultaneous that have taken place. On the impact of globalization, I think that it was initially seen that globalization, both the economic and trade dimension, the financial dimension, and the information revolution dimension with the rise of the internet and social media, were going to level the playing fields, meaning that they're going to bring more equality in the world because they're instruments that are going to be used by none of the old powers equally. And what we have seen, in fact, is quite the opposite in some cases. What we have seen in the case of the United States economically is that what Muhammad described, which is everybody benefits in absolute terms when you have some certain changes, it's not good enough because it's about relative gains, who gains more. Because what happened, what we've seen in America, is that globalization has increased the gap between the rich and the poor. So right now we have the widest gap. So if you're earning $100 more and the rich person is earning $1 million more, you're poorer in relative terms because your money is going to buy less in the marketplace. And what has happened tied to that is something that gave people the impression that despite the absolute rise in income, it's become harder for people to live what is being called the American dream. That is, if you work hard enough and you're skilled enough, you're going to be able to catch up, bridge the gap with the people who are richer. In fact, what has happened in the world is that money can earn more money than hard work. And so the people who are moneyed can expand their wealth far more than the poor can. And so what gave rise to Donald Trump in the first place was he gave those people the idea that he's going to level the economic field. That's one thing about the trade. He was going to go anti-globalization. So the fact that he can muster numbers to show that some people have benefited from tax cuts, but most of the benefits go to the rich, that's not going to comfort the people at the lower end, because they still find it impossible to advance. They haven't seen the benefits of advancement under his rule, and that's one driving force in the identity divide. But the second thing is the demographics. When I say demographics, I'm not just talking about racial demographic. That is obviously the expanding portion of America that is non-white, particularly African Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanic Americans. So America is not a white majority country anymore. We're getting away from that, and so with that there is tied a lot of tension. But it's not. I'm not speaking specifically about the racial divide. I'm talking about the globalized versus the non-globalized. What people don't really get is that tied to this ethnicity is something bigger, which is the way people see America's role in the world. For example, when we do polling, we ask people, do you speak a foreign language? Do you have a passport? Have you ever visited a foreign country? Have you ever studied in another country? Do you have relatives who've lived in a foreign country? Do you communicate with people outside the U.S. on a daily basis through social media? Now, if you say yes to any of these, and especially if you say yes to all of these, you're more likely to be egalitarian. You're more likely to be less America first. You're more likely to be Democrat, and so forth. So the demographics that we're talking about is about globalized segments of the American population versus rural America, people who have not been out. One of the interesting things is that there was on NBC News last week, a reporter went to Maine to talk to people before the midterm elections, and he talked to a young couple who were in the fishing business, and said, "What is concerning you most right now about the politics?" And they said, "Too much regulation." I said, what do you mean by too much regulation? Well, they're making it harder to fish in the right places, or they're making it harder to get a fishing license. So they focus entirely on fishing. He said, Have you ever heard of Paul Manafort? They said, "No. Who's that?" "Have you ever heard of Robert Mueller?" Who? So you have segments of the American people who are completely isolated and focus on their local issues, particularly in rural areas. Now that ties up to the polling. What did the polls predict or didn't predict early on? I have to say, first of all, that our poll, which I wrote an article before the election in Reuters with a colleague of mine, in which, of course, our poll, like every other poll, showed that Hillary was leading. There was nothing unusual about that. But we then analyzed the anti-establishment mood, and we said in that article that here's why Trump could win, because of this anti-establishment mood that is not captured in the poll, and we are not, and don't underestimate that. So we understood that, and frankly, when the polls were done, most of the polls were national polls. They were right. In fact, the last poll that was done prior to the election showed about what ended up being the difference at the national level, 3 million votes in favor of Hillary. But of course, the winning election is based on state by state. And ultimately, there were differences that took place. Whether or not the Russian intervention made a difference, I don't know. It's not really up to me to decide. One other point I want to make that's general, that ties to particularly what Mohammed said about the voter turnout. Mohammed's absolutely right. It's really, voter turnout is key. And this has been the issue. Republicans have been historically better at getting the turnout. And now and one of the differences, if you look at when Obama won versus when Hillary ran, Obama turned out the vote, particularly the minorities, especially African Americans, who are important to the Democratic constituency, and Hillary got less out. And that difference, if she had gotten the same numbers as Obama, within the Democratic Party, the same percentage of turnout, she would have won the election. There's no question. So energizing the base is clear, and one thing that Trump did was very, very successfully energized his base. Now, do we have any reason to think that Democrats will energize the base? Yes, we do have reason. And the reason isn't just speculative, and it's not just in terms of looking at the social media and the anger at Trump that is countered, but it is also based on the results of recent elections. Meaning even before the midterm, the individual elections that have taken place, the turnout has been extremely high, much higher than before among Democrats. And that includes African Americans and Hispanics, and especially women, who are extremely energized, and they do turn out in large numbers. Young people don't always turn out in large numbers. That's going to be a key constituency. We'll see whether or not they'll be energized, and that will make a difference for sure. But my guess, if elections were held today, the Democrats would win the House of Representatives. That is based on that result. Just one final point related to the Democratic Party moving left. There is a saying that Democrats always find a way to shoot themselves in the foot, even when, and there's truth to it historically. They're not as good as getting a very effective candidate on the table. And the question now is whether they are moving so much to the left that they'll alienate the center, because the independents are abandoning Trump. But will they rally behind some of the leftist forces? If Bernie Sanders is the candidate, or had been the candidate, would he energize them? There are different theories on that. Some people say yes, some people say no. But there is an emerging divide between your traditional Democrats and your new left, which is energized by younger people, and we've seen that in some of the elections so far, and that's an open question. I have to say, I don't really know how this is going to play itself out, and whether it's going to derail the rise of an effective Democratic presidential candidate, but it's not going to impact so much the midterm election. So that's really going to be more about the presidential election later on.
I mean, it has always been difficult to explain the US and the American system to Egyptians at large, and to students in particular. And I think with the election of Trump, it's becoming more complicated. For example, when I was explaining to my students the American electoral system, usually I didn't emphasize the electoral college and how it works, and because in most cases, those who won the popular vote won also the electoral college. Now it's very difficult to convince a student that Hillary Clinton won 3 million votes more, and she's not in the White House. However, the election of Trump actually helped me explain the role of individuals, the role of leaders in making American foreign policy. Because most people in our part of the world believe that, or have the perception that nothing changed in the US. It's all about American interest, that American interest does not change. No, it changes. Individuals matter. And there is huge difference between Trump and between Hillary Clinton, between Democrats and Republicans, and so on. But I think Egyptians have become more interested in American politics because it has become more entertaining. following the scandals of Trump and so on. I remember one producer of a night show in the US used to say that politics is show business for ugly people. So that's actually what's happening now, and there is a lot of entertainment, and a lot of Egyptians are following that. But I think the gap between Egypt and the US, Egyptians and Americans in general is becoming bigger. And many Egyptians think that the US has become irrelevant, a country that you cannot trust, a country that is no longer interested in the region or even in bilateral relation, and that doesn't matter at all, and that regional dynamics are probably more important than relationship with a superpower like the US. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn to the audience. We have roughly half an hour left. What I would like to do is take a round of questions from the audience to our panelists. That way we can organize what time we have more efficiently, I think. And then we can go on until the close of our session. Yes, please. Are there microphones? Why don't you take our microphone right here? Yes.
My name is Aziza Helmi. I'm a Human Resource Development Advisor and a former employee of the USAID established agency here in Egypt for 15 years. My question actually might sound a bit odd, but I would like to pose it. The question is, in the foreseeable future, do you anticipate or think that we could see a woman president of the United States? And tied up with that, was Hillary Clinton being a female had anything to do with her not making it? Thank you.
Thank you. I know we had a question here at the front.
Thank you. I have a very short comment to accentuate what you said about the identity politics. My former secretary was a staunch feminist, Asian American, recent immigrant, is now pro-white supremacist, and readily forgives Trump for his sexual transgressions and scandals. So that sort of confirms what you said, but he's holding very firm on his base among the evangelicals, although she's Catholic. So this is very strange. I associate myself with the remarks by Professor Kamal, and I want to just expand a little bit on the point what he said about the Democratic Party. There was a major op-ed in the New York Times 3 weeks ago about the using the word socialism in the primaries with the young candidates who won, with the Afghan woman, the Hispanic, and the Palestinian. Yes. So what do you think about that? As a matter of fact, it projected that this is the trend for the future, especially with the young people. I would like to get some comments from you about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Hassouna?
Well, I'd like to thank my friend Shibli for his statement, and also Mohammed Kamal. I lived in the United States for many years, and we had the occasion to work together on many issues. I think you mentioned a lot of minorities in your statement, the evangelicals, the Latins, but you never mentioned the Arab Americans, where we were involved together to energize the Arab Americans for many years. I was wondering, what is the role today? I know that they're divided. Some are Democrats, some are Republicans, but I think by and large, they of course feel also victims of the policies of Trump. And how are they doing? How are they defending their civil and political rights? This is my first question. I have another small question. President Trump, in spite of what he does, he has humiliated, for instance, Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. He has criticized Merkel. He has also, in some ways, criticized and humiliated the Arabs by his policies towards moving the embassy, closing the mission of Palestine, of the UNRWA, and still he gets away. There is no reaction. Maybe the only reaction in the world today is by China, who is hitting back on the trade war. So, of course, all this leaves the question that he thinks that whatever he does, he gets away with it. What's your reaction to that?
Thank you. Maybe the last question here from the front, and then we'll come back to our panel.
My name is Makram Abeid. I'm an ex-parliamentarian during the revolution of 2012. I have three quick comments, actually two comments and a question. My first comment is that I'm very surprised at people are being disturbed about the divide, about the polarization. That's a natural consequence of liberty, of liberalism, of a democratic society. I mean, it surely beats the totalitarian systems where you have only one voice and one path to go. The second comment quickly again is people are surprised at Trump. Trump is originally a billionaire, and in my private dealings as a financial advisor, when you deal with billionaires, they have two main criteria. A, their attention span is very, very limited. It's usually in seconds, 2-3 seconds. And secondly, they think they know it all because they've made it, and people giving them advice are just people that have not made it. So I'm surprised at people being surprised at Trump. And the third question is, you're advocating that Trump will not be impeached because Mike Pence is a worse choice. I mean, this is what I got from your comment. Who is the Democrats going to put against Trump in the next election? Do you think it could be an African-American lady like Michelle Obama? Could that be a possible candidate to run against President Trump? Especially that in the last few years, or sorry, excuse me, the last few elections, the American voters were zigzagging from one president all the way from the right all the way to the left. Could Michelle Obama be a candidate?
Thank you. Shibli?
I'm sure Mohammed will have reflections on the same question. On the women issue, you know, my own sense is that overwhelmingly America is no longer sexist, overwhelmingly, particularly the younger people. But sexism is still there, both structural sexism, you know, in the fact that you see the salaries are not yet equal in many fields for the same jobs, men and women. But I do not believe that Hillary Clinton lost because she was a woman. I do not believe that. Because I think the people who didn't vote for her because of that, and I'm sure there were some, would not voted for a Democrat anyway. So there were sexists out there, and maybe that's a motivating factor for them. I don't really think so. I mean, I think that, and I've known her for a long time. I respect her a lot. She's very smart. Arguably smarter than her husband, or no, not as politically astute as her husband. But she was not the warmest candidate. I mean, that was recognized by a lot of people. I don't think it's the issue. On the base hold on Trump, or the Trump hold on the base, you have to put it this way, and I can give you some examples here that are really telling. You know, if you talk to members of Congress privately, and I do to some, including people who vote for him or support him or don't necessarily attack him, they dislike him profoundly, even those who support him. But you have to put it in two ways. One way, of course, he's still got 80% support among Republicans, or sometimes more. And so if they're going to win in elections, they he can turn that base against them, so they're scared of him. But more importantly, even without that, they thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. This was going to be the year of Hillary. They'd given up. And they were giving up that the Supreme Court was going to be defined by Democrats. There was one already on the table, and now there's a second one. And lo and behold, he saved them. And look at what he did. He's giving them the tax cuts they had wanted. All of them. It's not just Donald Trump, it's all the Republicans that have been wanting his judge. He's given them those the Supreme Court appointments that they've been craving. So why would they want to lose him to a Democrat? Well, I mean, that's the question. They would take him with all his flaws because he's delivering on the issues they care about. They will take him over Hillary Clinton any day of the week because of the agenda. That also goes to people who are evangelical. I didn't address the evangelical issue. As Muhammad said, I'm writing a book on the evangelicals, doing a lot of research on them, including doing public opinion polling. As we speak, I have a public opinion poll fielded among evangelicals. And you would think that he would be the last person they would support because of because of his character and what he stands for. But you know what? He is giving them every single thing they want. Private support for private schools, making schools tax exempt, religious schools. They've wanted that. They abandoned Jimmy Carter. I interviewed Jimmy Carter on this issue back on when he had his confrontation with the evangelical in the late 1970s, when he was considered a born-again Christian, one of them, and they abandoned him toward the end because he wouldn't give them the tax cuts for religious schools that they wanted. And this guy comes in and says, I'm going to give you that, and I'm going to give you what you want. And I'm going to. So he's giving them what they want. And as one of them said, one of the leaders, Franklin Graham, said, he may not be a perfect Christian, but he's saving Christianity in America, or something like that. So people see him as instrumental, despite his flaws, and they're putting aside, or they're holding their noses on other issues, and they're embracing him. So it's not shocking, because I think that's often the case in politics. People do what is instrumental for their interests. On ethnic, the people who are winning, like Cortez, Puerto Rican American, like Tlaib, the Palestinian American, people who are winning. And not only winning, here's the interesting thing, it's not what we haven't had ethnic Americans win. We've had Arab Americans in Congress. We've even had Palestinian Americans in Congress as Sununu, and in government, like Sununu, who was also Palestinian American, who didn't say that initially, but now says it outwardly. But what's interesting here is not that you have ethnics being elected. That's not new. It is that they're being, in the context of the mainstream, relatively radical in their position. They're embracing, like Tlaib saying, I'm for one state. 2 states is too late. That's going against the mainstream. She's embracing a position that coincides more with her ethnicity in the context of, her constitution is permissive. It's not mostly Arab Americans, by the way. It is principally African Americans who are receptive to that kind of message. So from constituency to constituency, you can have, candidates succeed. The question is whether they can succeed nationally. There's a difference between electing someone in a district versus getting elected statewide or nationwide. That's yet to be tested. With Arab Americans, it's just too small a number. It's simply too small a number, except in a few states. Michigan obviously is one of them. And Michigan, yes, they're a force, and it's making a difference, but just the numbers are too small. The natural divide in America, I don't think so. It's not a natural divide in America. As I said, I've been doing polling in America for decades, and this is the deepest divide on issues I have ever seen. America has always had divide, sometimes political, along party lines, partisan divide. On many issues like abortion or some things like that, but in particular on foreign policy issues, on general American values issues, the gap has been very small. We have never had, 88% on one side and 88% on the other side. That is just unprecedented, and that carries through on almost every issue, including ones that used to have unanimity. So I think it's something really much more new in this regard. With Trump impeachment, I don't want to say that the only reason he wouldn't be impeached is because the Democrats don't want him impeached, because even if Democrats wanted to impeach, they don't hold Congress right now. And even if they were to win the House, they need 2/3 in the Senate to be able to get it, and they're not going to be able to get it, and unless something disastrous happened for Trump between now and then, like shooting someone on Fifth Avenue. But I just don't see it. So it's a very much an uphill battle. However, what the Democrats think they can do is weaken him and prevent him from appointing Supreme Court justices. They can investigate more scandals, call more people into the process, disrupt his agenda, and so forth, and they'll lay the framework for the presidential election. Who will they put against him? It's really hard to predict. We have seen this the first time Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in, and suddenly Barack Obama came out of nowhere, and he won the nomination. And she had all the money initially. She was the known victor by conventional wisdom. He came out of nowhere, and he took it over. This time, she almost lost it to Bernie Sanders. Who would have thought that Bernie Sanders would have come out of nowhere, given his, what he stands for, his personality and so forth, to be able to do it? It's very unpredictable, but there are some, the question on whether it be Michelle Obama, I doubt it. There are African Americans who are running. There is Senator Booker from New Jersey, who's obviously ambitious and likely to run. Kamala Harris from California, who's very popular. In fact, public opinion polls show her as one of the players in the field. So, of course, we're going to see African Americans again in the field for sure.
Just two quick comments. I agree completely that Hillary did not lose the election because she was a woman. She was not the right candidate for the swing states, and it was all about the swing states. Trump realized, or as a businessman, sensed that there is a demand for a political commodity in these states. Okay, a commodity that was anti-immigrant, anti-globalization, and so on. And he provided that commodity, and that's why he won. And he won mainly in the swing states, and that's what brought him to the White House. I would like to add something to what Mr. Makram Abeid said. Yeah, I think it's very important to understand Trump's background as a businessman, to explain or understand his conduct of foreign policy. But there is another actually very interesting experience that most analysts overlook, which is his experience with TV, what do you call it, reality TV. He had a very successful program, and that actually I never watched, but actually it seems it was very popular, and that's what put him actually on the national map. He didn't come from nowhere, but millions of Americans were watching him before he ran for office. And that's why he's actually interested in sensation, limelight, people talking about him, ratings, and so on. So this actually also was a very important experience and helped us understand his conduct of the state.
Thank you. Let's another round of questions? I see, yes, the gentleman here, please.
I would like to thank the panel. You have a very wealthy information that we have taken. My name is Sharif Kolta. I am board member in Egyptian American Friendship Association, a banker, and a graduate of Economics American University. I have quick comments. I don't believe that Russia had any influence on the elections, because if we open this door, then we have the European Union, then we have China, then we have other countries who might be interested to change the policy or the president of the United States. I mean, the post of the president of the most powerful country in the world, I don't believe that Russia has this power or influence to get this president or move this president. This is a comment. Another thing is concerning the decision-making of Trump or whoever comes to the post of the president of the United States. The United States is a country of institutions. They have research centers, they have Senate, and each Senate has his advisors, because nobody has all the information. Nobody is a politician. Trump is an economist. And even if you remember, we had an actor who is I mean, there is Ronald Reagan was an actor, so we don't believe that the president of the United States will issue or will take decisions without having an advisor and without going into a plan, a political plan for the country. That his role is to execute the plan. But he doesn't go in the morning, he says, I'm thinking of this, I'm going to do it, and he does it, because this is the United States is the most powerful country in the world. So it doesn't go this way. So I don't believe that Trump, it's not Trump, it's the policy of the United States. For example, the move of the embassy. It was not the decision of Trump. I believe this was a decision which was made before that, and his role was to take it. I mean, to execute this decision, which was taken years before, to do it now. So this is the role of Trump. I mean, he didn't say, he didn't do this decision. I mean, so he is doing the plan of institutions in the United States.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask you to hand the microphone to the gentleman right behind you? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Talhami and Dr. Kamal. My name is Mohammed Nasser. I'm a writer at the Arab News. And I have two quick questions. Question number one, can you tell us more about relationship between President Trump and the American establishments? And question number two is, how good is President Trump's relationship with Arab leaders, especially Egypt and Saudi Arabia? Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back, yes? And then we'll double to the front.
I second I second the question about the question on the evangelicals is very important for us in the Middle East to understand about, what do they want, what is their political demands, and how important they are in the American electorate.
Thank you.
Please comment on that.
And then the gentleman here, yes?
Thank you. My name is Pascal Anik. I work for the International Labour Organization here in Cairo. Two short questions. One has been already touched. You use the term division a lot. You mentioned division among the media in your opinion polls, stronger division between Republican and Democrats. In so many countries, there is no official division. Isn't it a good sign of democracy? That's my first question. The second question, you insisted on the rising identity due to Trump. Isn't it, it's also a very important cleavage, for instance, now in Europe, between, on the one hand, the nationalist or protectionist movement, insisting also on their Christian identity, and on the other hand, the pro-European secular progressist movement. So is the election of Trump part of a more global trends towards developing nationalist movement? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Bahgat, you have the last question in this round.
I want to come to the impact on foreign policy and taking what many people think is legitimacy crisis of Trump. I don't know how many people from inside the White House have resigned, 9 or 10, something like that. And my question specifically is, I heard that people in the State Department have been demoralized. So what is the impact of that legitimacy crisis, chaos in the White House, the decision-making group, the State Department, lack of friends outside? I mean, I think many people are rediscovering the book, the old book, The Ugly American. So what is the impact of all of that on the absence of America as a leader? I was surprised a little bit, Shibli, when you said he is the most important or strongest man. America is still the strongest country. I don't know if he is still the strongest man. I think many people are worried about him trying to restrict his power on the nuclear button. I mean, there's a lot of, he's losing power. So with all these aspects, where are we about American foreign policy? And what is the impact of that on the rise of Russia, China? How can we deal with that in the Middle East? Do we come closer to Trump or we take a distance with Trump?
Thank you. Shibli?
Yeah, let me start with the question about Russian interference in our elections. Let me just caveat this by saying I know that America has intervened in other elections around the world. I mean, and it's documented. So it's not. I'm not saying this without paying attention to the fact that America has done it and frequently in multiple elections. But there is absolutely no doubt that Russia intervened in our elections. This is the conclusion of all the intelligence services, all the media analysis that we have, that they have attempted and succeeded in intervening in our elections on multiple levels, and there are evidence of it, all over the place, and it's out there in the open discourse. The only question is, did it make a difference? That's the only question. And there we don't know. I mean, I can't tell you that I have the answer. I reported to you that some people really believe it did make a difference. I haven't reached that conclusion. I have no way of knowing. I just put that out there on the table. But that they intervened, there's absolutely no question. Now, in terms of Trump himself and the judgment of him being reflective of establishment, of being an economist himself, this is absolutely not what we're getting from everyone who's worked in the White House and has come out, from all the leaks that have come out, from all the books that have been written, from all the private conversations we have with people in the establishment, those of us who live in Washington. It's not at all even on the economic issues. Obviously, he's a successful businessman. There's even a debate about that. But to say, for example, he's an economist, this is a man who, according to the Woodward book, when he was told there was a deficit in America, he said, why don't we print more money? He ordered to print more money to imagine an economist ever doing that. His decisions that he has made, including ones on Jerusalem, a lot of the decisions have been made by people around him against the establishment itself, meaning against the wishes of the CIA, against the wishes of the State Department, and against the wishes of the Defense Department, including, according to Woodward, his decision on cultivating the relationship with the Saudi monarchy and how that developed, that it was principally a decision of his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who went against the advice of every single bureaucracy in the U.S., especially the intelligence community. So and tied to that, we do know, just to hook it to Baghat's final question, we do know that the bureaucracies are somewhat demoralized, and obviously not only based on the people who left. I mean, remember, a lot of people have left already, multiple people, unprecedented number of people in less than 2 years. Not only a lot of people have left, but remember, his first national security advisor has been indicted, and he's cooperating with Mueller. His campaign manager has been convicted in court, and he is cooperating with Mueller. His personal lawyer has been indicted, and he's cooperating with Mueller. People who were very close to him, including from the days of reality TV, are writing books about how he does business inside. We have an anonymous source from the White House that they can't even find, who writes an op-ed piece saying, we see it ourselves to guard the Republic against him, basically, because there's a report about Cohen taking out a document from his desk because he's terrified that he might see it and sign it and then hurt the interests of the United States, so he takes it away from his desk and hides it from him. This is not the picture that is painted of this president, that he's a typical establishment person. And we're basing that not on speculation, on a lot of information that has come out. And don't delude yourself to think this is really somebody who's the typical president. Every president has his peculiarity. But even with campaign promises, people they say a lot when they campaign. When they come in, they weigh American interests. The bureaucracies say you got to swallow this, and they swallow it. That has to do with the embassy decision too. There was no pressure on him from public opinion at all. There was pressure on him from some of the fundraisers like Adelson, some of the evangelical advisors, but not even evangelical public opinion. I did a public opinion poll the week before he made that decision, and a majority of Americans opposed his moving the embassy to Jerusalem. And Republicans were about evenly divided on that issue. They were not strongly supportive of his moving to Jerusalem. There was no pressure on him. You could have easily said, let me at least put my proposal on the table. This was really his key advisors, Kushner, David Friedman, and Jason Greenblatt, using the political weight of people from the outside to push an agenda of their own, and the president not being relatively clueless in all this, because this idea of that he is fulfilling promises is used as an excuse to rationalize and justify a policy. It's not the real driving force of policy, because every president has had to bypass promises. So it's not, I think we got to probe much deeper than that. We are facing a different kind of reality. We're facing something unprecedented in American history. And we really have to come to grips with it. We all have to come to grips with it, for good or for bad. We have to come to grips with it. None of us know how to deal with it, but we have to recognize it is especially unusual. Now, does he have a relationship with the establishment? What is the establishment? You know, he's a powerful guy. When he was rich, a lot of people wanted to deal with him because of his money and his ability, or reality TV and influence. Even the Clintons, you know, had a relationship with him. They wanted to get support for, you know, for the campaigns. Politicians seek him. And so he's not completely outside the establishment. That's the oddity of it, that sort of he positions himself as anti-establishment. But at the same time, the establishment doesn't have much respect for him, including people who support him. So in that sense, he really isn't one of them. They do see him as an outsider, and that works very well for his core constituency. On the media, you know, the American media, thankfully, is still independent. It doesn't mean that it's always right. It doesn't mean that it doesn't make mistakes. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have agenda. We have multiple differences, and again, you find contrasts from Fox News to MSNBC in that range. But nonetheless, we have a space that no one has been able to close. And certainly Trump hasn't been able to close it. So Trump's different from any other president of the United States in the sense of, with a paintbrush, painting the media as the enemy of the people. And now America has always seen the media as part of the American democracy. But he's painted the media as the enemy of the American people. And then, of course, uses the term fake news for everything that he doesn't agree with. And on the other hand, the media, like the Washington Post, that keeps track of his statements, claims that they document on the average 12 misstatements, if not lies, by him every single day since he's taken office. That's on the average. So, so the reality of it is, the media is, you know, he sees himself partly in a war with the media, but he loves them because he obviously he likes to engage them. He hates the New York Times, but loves the New York Times. He reads it like crazy. When there's something he wants to disagree with, he'll pick up what they say. And when they say something relatively positive about him, he will highlight it in his tweets. The media has been, in some ways, become more complicated by the social media, and that's why he has taken to the social media. There's never been a president who used Twitter like he has. This is his principal direct way of communicating with his base, and that has really transformed the way you know, the way a leader communicates with the public. One final thought on what Bahgat said. How do we deal with this? You know, how do we deal with this? I don't know, and I'm not sure how the rest of the world would deal with it. It obviously has bearing on relations with the Middle East, including the Arab world. And I think that most leaders in the world don't want to get on his wrong side, but don't want to get too close to him, because they know they'll be, if they're implicated in that identity politics and people see you as Trump's friend, they're not going to like you. And on the other hand, you don't want to be on his wrong side. So most people walk in that thin line. Some people hope this is a phenomenon that will disappear in a couple of years and will go away, so they will wait their time. Others, like the Germans, are asserting that they can no longer trust America and they got to find a way that is a European answer or German answer. You hear that increasingly in the German public discourse. But I think people are grappling with it because it's new.
Very quick comment on what Dr. Sharif Kolta raised. I think the US will survive Trump, mainly because of the resilience of its institution. I think the institution, the US, are very strong. They're gonna absorb Trump's shock and move on. If you're interested, I want to bring to your attention a book that is actually a bestseller in the US for many weeks. It's called The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. by a famous historian called John Mitcham. He argues that the US have seen much worse president than Trump, president who supported racism and slavery and so on. But at the end of the day, the angels, won, and the progressive movement succeeded at the end of the day. Thank you.
Since we started a few minutes late, I will, with the permission of the Dean, take one final round of 3 questions and come back to our audience. Please keep your questions brief. Keep it to one question, and then we would go back for closing comments to our panelists. Yes, please. Do we have a microphone for the gentleman?
Thank you, Professor Chibli and Professor Kamal, for your comments. I have one quick question. At the beginning of your talk, you spoke about the fact that Trump won the elections because, he didn't get the votes of the undecided voters, but instead he won the votes of those who support him. Does that mean that Republicans are more likely or more interested in voting in elections than Democrats? That's one question. My second question is, what decides the decision of Americans in general to go and vote? Is it about the candidate itself or about the party affiliation? And thank you so much.
Other questions? Yes, the gentleman behind you.
First of all, thank you to Dean Nabil Fahmy for this forum. I think we need more of these events, so thanks for keeping it going. Question to the panel, who have been really excellent in their discourse so far, relating to where we're going. You mentioned the 40th anniversary of the Camp David, but nobody's talking about the 50th anniversary of humanity actually reaching to space and taking the first photo of the globe, the blue planet. And the question I have is, moving away from the age of empires to the rise of nations, to discovering a common identity in the ability to see the planet, what would it take for us to move away from small geopolitical challenges to human challenges?
Thank you. Yes, the lady at the back there, you have the final question for our panel.
My name is Nadia Al-Dakruri, Egyptian journalist from Al-Watan newspaper. A lot of books have been published recently about Donald Trump and have talked about the decision makers in the White House. In your opinion, who is standing now behind Donald Trump's decision? Thanks.
Thank you. I think the question was who is standing behind? Who is guiding his decisions?
Who is standing now behind the Donald Trump decisions?
Thank you. Thank you. Please forgive me for those of you who I could not get to with your questions, but we need to come back to our panel with closing thoughts.
Sure. First on energizing the voters turnout, as I said and Mohammed said, is really central, and it's a good question. And Republicans often are better organized. They turn out the vote. Partly also there's structural barriers to getting African-American votes and minority votes out, and sometimes even structural discrimination to discourage them from participating in certain districts. So those are battles that have had to be fought, but there are times when Democrats have fully energized, and Obama was able to mobilize a lot of the Democrats, including minorities, and I happen to think that Democrats will be energized. I also think Republicans will be energized, so I think it's going to be interesting. We don't know, but if they're both equally energized, the Democrats will win because that's where the numbers are overall. In terms of the question is who's guiding Trump, it depends on what question. I mean, the theory about this man is that he doesn't have a strong ideology, he's amoral, and he doesn't have a strong attention span. His top advisors basically could easily figure out to push an agenda that they want, knowing his weaknesses and strength. That's one of the theories that we have, and that happens to be also particularly on question like the Middle East. He obviously sometimes instinctively tweets and therefore creates policy that everybody has to clean after, because once he takes a position, he's not going to back down from it. And so everybody tries to figure out how to deal with it. But nonetheless, remember, if most issues in the country are not dealt with the president. The president's bandwidth is very narrow. The number of issues he's going to deal with is going to be very small. And so on the vast majority of the issues, America functions as it does. He's not going to interfere with the bureaucracies on the overwhelming majority of issues. We're only talking about some big issues that concern him and that concern the region in this case, where he's going to be interventionist. But on all the other issues, you know, the bureaucracies run it, and he's not going to notice it. In fact, in a way, he gives the military almost a free hand beyond certain decisions that he makes. To maybe more than Obama in some ways. He gives the military a bigger hand. The second question, I don't remember what it was about, sorry.
The blue planet.
Huh?
The blue planet came from the gentleman.
Oh yes, well, I mean, I think that's actually a really good question because I mean, we're focused on America and Trump. We're focused on identity politics. We're focused on the impact of globalization. That is really not just in America. I mean, we see the Brexit in the UK. We see the rise of the right and nativism in Italy. We see the rise of nativism and ultranationalism in Hungary. We see even in Sweden, the most liberal of European countries, where the right is making an expansion. And so we see what people have called nativism, in the sense of sort of like not wanting to connect with the rest of the world and not wanting to see immigrants and not wanting to see more globalization. At the very same time that demographically we see more expansion. And it's in a way it's a reaction, or people read it as a reaction. What does it take to energize that dimension of connectivity with others, of thinking as human beings, or I use the term egalitarian rather than thinking native? I don't know what the answer to it is. We're all grappling with it right now. This is really one of the big issues of the time. But I'm an optimist about the trend. And I see a trajectory that is moving us in the direction of more collectivity, despite the efforts of people to stop it. And that's just maybe a wishful thinking on my part, but I think it's more than that.
I will answer the question, who is behind Trump's Middle East policy? And I actually learned that answer from Dr. Talhami over lunch 2 days ago. I was talking about the evangelicals and their influence and so on, and he said, no, it's Jared Kushner, okay, Trump's son-in-law, and he sometimes uses the evangelicals as an excuse, for these policy changes. With regards to the midterms and the presidential elections, I think demographics are important, but again, turning out the vote is the challenge. It's a challenge for the Republicans, but it's more challenge for the Democrats. It's a challenge for the Democrats to win the states that Obama has won before. And I think one of the biggest challenges also to energize the millennium generation, the young voters who still very apathetic about the political system and do not have motivation to participate in elections. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlemen, on behalf of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, gentlemen and ladies, of course, and the audience, You've both left us more informed, more understanding of what is going on in America, but perhaps less reassured about what is going on. I'm struck by what you mentioned, Shibli, about the situation being a mess. And I think that is perhaps the best way to encapsulate what is a very dynamic and uncertain time for the United States. Gentlemen, thank you for your insights. I would ask you to join me in thanking our two panelists, and thank you as an audience for joining us tonight.